Welcome to North Stories. The first thing they tell you when you walk into Coldwater Penitentiary is simple. Abandon hope. A banner of grim promises stretched across the yard, wrapping its words around every brick, every bar, every set of eyes staring back at you. My name, let's call me Jack Finch, might not mean much now, but it meant even less when I first stepped into that crumbling fortress of concrete and iron. It was 1957, a time when the world outside seemed to be spinning forward at an unstoppable pace. But inside Coldwater, time had frozen into something else. Something ugly. I was sentenced to 2 life terms for the murder of my wife, Evelyn, and her lover, a crime I didn't commit. I don't say that to ask for pity. I say it because it's the truth, plain and simple. But the truth? Well, the truth's a rare commodity in a place like Coldwater. The courtroom felt distant now, just a flickering nightmare in the back of my mind. I still remember the look on the judge's face when he handed down my sentence. Cold. Unmoved. Like it was just another name on his list. Evelyn had been everything to me, and when she was found dead alongside that man in our bed, the world turned its back on me, almost too easily. The evidence was damning, sure, but I knew better. I knew someone else had done this, and if I ever made it out of Coldwater, I was going to find them. When they pushed me through the gates of Coldwater for the first time, the sun was high, but there was no warmth in it. The guards had rough hands and rougher words. They made sure you felt small, powerless. As the thick doors slammed shut behind me, the prison roared to life. The inmates, they shouted, they howled, a chorus of madness welcoming me to hell. My heart raced. Everyone around me looked like they'd been carved from stone, all except one man. He stood apart from the others, leaning against the wall with a certain ease, arms crossed, eyes sharp. We would later call him Red. But back then, he was just another face in the crowd. They herded us new arrivals like cattle, stripping us down, hosing us off. It wasn't just the water, it was the humiliation of it all. Cold and indifferent, just like the guards who stood there, laughing under their breath. It was their way of breaking you before you even set foot in a cell. My first night in Coldwater was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. There's a quiet that exists in prisons, an uneasy silence that hangs over everything. It was the kind of quiet that waits to be shattered. And that's exactly what happened when the older inmates began their taunts. Whispering in the dark. Threats. Warnings. It was all part of the game. Red had already placed a bet with a few others on which one of us would snap first. It didn't take long to find out. Somewhere down the row, someone cracked. I never saw his face, but I heard his voice. Screaming. Crying out for mercy that would never come. And then, like a shadow slipping through the bars, the head guard, Thomas Harlow, Coldwater's answer to a monster, came striding in. He didn't waste a second. Harlow had this way about him, like a lion cornering prey. He beat that poor man senseless, right there in front of everyone. And we watched. What else could we do? The next morning, we heard the man had died in the infirmary. But no one was surprised. That was Coldwater. The days blurred into one another after that. Weeks felt like years. I tried to keep my head down, to avoid drawing attention to myself. But in a place like Coldwater, there's only so long you can hide. There was a gang in there, a crew that called themselves the Ravens. They had a leader, Royce, a mean son of a gun with a scar that ran the length of his face. They had this ritual, a way of hazing the new blood. And it didn't take long for them to set their sights on me. It started small, whispers in the yard, bumps in the cafeteria, but it escalated fast. By my 3rd month, they cornered me in the laundry room. 3 of them. Royce in front, the other 2 flanking him like attack dogs. I had no choice but to defend myself, but in Coldwater, defending yourself was a declaration of war. After the fight, they took me to solitary. It was meant to be punishment, but the truth was, I needed the break. The walls of the solitary cell were tight, the darkness complete. The silence? Almost a relief. For 14 days I sat in that cell with nothing but my thoughts. I thought about Evelyn. I thought about the life I'd lost. And I thought about Red. When I got out, Red was waiting. He had this way of knowing when a man had hit his limit. He walked over calm, like he was offering advice on the weather. "You lasted longer than most," he said, a cigarette hanging from his lips. "Royce likes to test the new ones. But you handled yourself." I didn't say much in return. Words felt small, unnecessary. But Red had a way of talking, like he knew how to fill the spaces between silences. Over time, he became my closest friend inside those walls. It was Red who helped me get my bearings in Coldwater, introduced me to his crew, the men who had carved out a semblance of existence in this forgotten corner of the world. There was Brooks, the old-timer who ran the library, a relic from another era. He'd been inside so long, he didn't even know what life outside looked like anymore. Then there was Parker, who handled the small luxuries, the cigarettes, the occasional bottle of booze smuggled in through God knows what means. And of course, there was Red, the fixer. If you wanted something, anything, Red could get it, for a price. But Coldwater wasn't just about survival. It was about keeping a piece of yourself intact. That's what Red taught me. No matter how small that piece was, you had to hold on to it. Because once Coldwater took everything, it took your soul with it. It wasn't long before I found a way to make myself useful. You see, before all of this, I was an accountant. I'd spent years understanding the intricate web of numbers and finance, learning how the system worked. Inside Coldwater, that skill became my ticket out of the shadows. One day, while we were working on the roof of one of the old buildings, I overheard Harlow complaining about his taxes. It was a small thing, just grumbling really, but it stuck with me. When he passed by me, I did something I never thought I'd do. I spoke up. "I could help you with that," I said. The words tasted foreign in my mouth. Harlow stopped, turned to me, and for a moment I thought he might throw me off the roof for daring to speak. But instead, he laughed, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the yard. "You? Help me?" I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was an accountant. I could save you some money. Legally." For a long second, Harlow just stared at me, sizing me up. Then, slowly, a grin spread across his face. "You save me money, Finch, and I'll see to it you're treated right. Deal?" I nodded again, not fully understanding what I had just done. That night, Harlow made good on his word. He brought me papers, tax forms, and I went to work. It didn't take long before I had something for him, a legal loophole that would save him a chunk of his paycheck. In return, Harlow brought beer to the roof the next time we worked, 1 bottle for every man in the crew. For the first time since I arrived, I saw something I hadn't seen in months: men smiling, laughing. That was the beginning. Word spread quickly. Soon, it wasn't just Harlow. Other guards started coming to me, asking for help with their taxes, their finances, anything that might give them a little edge. And with each favor, my status inside Coldwater grew. I wasn't just another prisoner anymore. I was someone useful. But usefulness in a place like Coldwater comes at a cost. I could feel the eyes on me, Norton, the warden, most of all. The thing about Coldwater Penitentiary was that every step you took felt like you were being watched. The walls had eyes, the shadows whispered, and there was always someone waiting for you to slip up. Warden Norton was at the center of it all, a man who didn't just run the prison, he owned it. His presence hung over every part of that place like a storm cloud that never moved. Norton wasn't your typical warden. He had this air of righteousness, always talking about redemption and how God had a plan for every man inside Coldwater's walls. It was a lie, of course. Norton's real God was power, and that power came from the crooked deals he made outside those iron gates. But he wore the mask well, quoting scripture and keeping a Bible on his desk like it was an extension of himself. That Bible had its place in everything Norton did, and I'd soon find out just how deep its meaning went. I wasn't the only one who noticed Norton watching me. Red had warned me, though not with words. He didn't need them. One look at his face and I knew. This place didn't just chew up prisoners, It swallowed anyone who got too close to the wrong people. And there was no one more wrong than Norton. A few weeks after I'd started helping Harlow and some of the other guards with their taxes, Norton called me into his office. It wasn't a request. It was an order, one of those silent commands that comes when the guards march you down a long, cold hallway, each footstep echoing louder than the last. Norton's office was strangely quiet when I walked in. He sat behind his large, wooden desk, the kind that seemed too polished for a place like Coldwater, and that Bible was laid out in front of him, open to some verse I couldn't quite see. His eyes lifted from the pages as I stood there, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips like he knew something I didn't. "Jack Finch," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I've been hearing things about you." I didn't answer at first. I had learned quickly that silence was sometimes the best defense in Coldwater. You never said more than you needed to, and with Norton, I knew every word would be weighed and judged. "You've become quite popular with the guards," he continued, tapping the edge of the Bible with a single finger. "Taxes. Finances. Things that aren't typically a prisoner's concern. I just do what I know," I said finally, my voice even. "I'm trying to make myself useful." "Useful," he repeated, rolling the word around his mouth like it had a different meaning to him. "I like that, Finch. Useful is exactly what you're going to be." And just like that, I was pulled into something far bigger than taxes. Norton laid it out for me in a way that felt almost casual. Coldwater was more than just a prison, it was an empire, and Norton sat at the top of it. Money came in from all sides, bribes, kickbacks, laundering. It wasn't just about keeping the prison running, it was about filling pockets. Big pockets. And he wanted me to help him keep it all straight. "I need someone with your skills," Norton said, pushing a few papers across his desk. "Someone who can ensure that things run smoothly. No mistakes." I glanced at the papers. Financial records. Accounts I hadn't heard of, but I knew exactly what they were. It didn't take an accountant to see that this was dirty money, moving in and out of places it had no business being. Norton watched me closely, waiting to see if I'd resist, if I'd hesitate. But resisting Norton wasn't an option. In Coldwater, you didn't say no to the warden. Not if you wanted to keep your head attached to your shoulders. So I picked up the papers and nodded. "I can do that," I said quietly, my voice barely carrying above the hum of the radiator in the corner. "Good," Norton said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "I knew you were the right man for the job." From that moment on, I was in. There was no turning back. Every month, I'd meet with Norton in his office, running through the books, cleaning up his financial messes, keeping things neat and tidy so no one outside Coldwater would suspect a thing. It was a delicate balancing act, and the deeper I got into it, the more I realized just how dangerous it all was. But there were perks to being Norton's personal accountant. My status in Coldwater changed almost overnight. The guards left me alone, even the most brutal ones like Harlow. The other prisoners noticed too, especially Red. We still talked, still passed time in the yard or over a game of chess in the common area, but there was an unspoken understanding between us now. I was no longer just Jack Finch, the new guy. I was someone who had a line to Norton, and in Coldwater that meant something. The Ravens, the gang that had tried to break me in the laundry room, backed off completely. Royce, their leader, even nodded at me one day when we passed in the hall. It was a strange, uneasy truce, but I didn't question it. I knew better than to poke at things that didn't need poking. Still, there was no escaping the fact that Coldwater was tightening its grip on me. Every day I spent working for Norton, I felt like I was digging myself deeper into a hole I'd never get out of. But what choice did I have? I wasn't going to rot in that place for a crime I didn't commit. I had to survive. And survival meant playing Norton's game. Then, one afternoon, something changed. It started with a letter, a crumpled envelope slipped under my cell door. I didn't recognize the handwriting, and when I opened it, the words inside hit me like a freight train. "I know who really killed your wife." I stared at the note for what felt like hours, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no name, no signature, nothing to tell me who had sent it. But the words were there, staring back at me, pulling me deeper into a mystery I thought had died with Evelyn. I didn't tell anyone about the note, not even Red. It was too dangerous, too uncertain. Instead, I tucked it away, hidden under my mattress where the guards wouldn't find it. And every night, I lay awake, wondering if this was the break I'd been waiting for. Was someone in Coldwater connected to the real killer? Or was this just another cruel joke, designed to push me over the edge? As the days passed, I tried to focus on my work, keeping Norton's books clean, keeping my head down. But the note was always there, lingering at the back of my mind. I couldn't shake it. And then, 2 weeks after the note appeared, something else happened. It was a cold, rainy night, the kind where the water seeped through the cracks in the walls and the wind howled like a ghost outside the bars. I was in the library, helping Brooks with some of the new books that had come in, part of a donation Norton had orchestrated to make himself look good. The library was one of the few places in Coldwater that felt halfway human, a quiet refuge from the madness outside. That's when I saw him. A new prisoner, standing in the corner, looking lost. He was young, no more than 25, with a mop of unruly hair and eyes that darted nervously around the room. Something about him felt different, like he didn't belong in a place like Coldwater. Brooks noticed him too, and in his usual calm way, he walked over and introduced himself. The kid, whose name was Tommy, looked up, startled, like he hadn't expected anyone to talk to him. "Just got in," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "They said this place had books, so here I am." Brooks smiled warmly, gesturing to the shelves. "We've got all kinds here. Take your pick." But Tommy didn't move. Instead, he glanced around the library, his eyes landing on me for a moment before flicking away. "You're Jack Finch," he said, not a question, but a statement. I nodded slowly. "I've heard about you," Tommy continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They say you help people in here. With stuff." I didn't like where this was going. Something about Tommy's nervous energy set off alarm bells in my head. "What do you need?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Tommy hesitated, glancing around again before leaning in closer. "I think I know something about your wife's murder." The room felt like it had shifted, the walls closing in as Tommy's words hung between us. My throat went dry, but I forced myself to stay calm. "What do you know?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tommy glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one was listening. "I was in another prison before this, downstate. There was a guy there. He bragged about killing a woman and her lover, making it look like the husband did it. Said it was easy money." My heart stopped. Tommy didn't know it, but he had just blown my world wide open. As the rain battered the windows and the clock ticked on, I knew one thing for sure: Coldwater wasn't done with me yet. Tommy's words felt like a punch to the gut, a wave of cold, harsh truth crashing over me. I didn't want to believe him at first. The story he told, about the man who bragged of killing my wife and her lover, was too good to be true, too convenient. And in a place like Coldwater, you learned quickly that nothing came for free. Nothing was ever that simple. I stared at Tommy, my mind racing. He didn't know what I had gone through. He couldn't have known. But the details he gave, the casual mention of a setup, the arrogance of a killer who thought he'd gotten away with it, chipped away at my doubts. It sounded exactly like the kind of thing that could happen. That did happen. Maybe Tommy really had stumbled onto something. "Who is this guy?" I asked, my voice tight, trying to keep the rush of emotions in check. I could feel my pulse pounding in my neck, each beat like a drum signaling the past was clawing its way back. Tommy shifted uneasily on his feet. "His name's Jeffers. Or at least, that's what everyone called him. Some lowlife in a joint downstate, bragging about his hits. Said he worked for some guy who paid him to take care of things, you know? His favorite job was framing people. Told anyone who'd listen that the key to getting away with murder was making sure someone else took the fall." That last sentence hit like a gunshot, ripping through me. Making someone else take the fall. That was exactly what had happened to me. My wife, Evelyn, and her lover, gunned down in cold blood, and the blame had landed squarely on my shoulders. I'd been a fool for thinking that justice would see through it. Instead, it had chained me to Coldwater for life. "Where is Jeffers now?" I asked, barely keeping my composure. If there was any truth in Tommy's story, if Jeffers was out there, still alive, still free. Tommy shrugged, glancing around nervously like he expected someone to jump out of the shadows. "Last I heard, he was working for some small-time crew in Boston, but that was a couple of years ago. He gets around." The frustration gnawed at me. This wasn't the kind of place where you could just make a phone call and find out where someone was. I had no access to the outside world, no power over what happened beyond the iron gates of Coldwater. But if Tommy was right, if Jeffers was still alive, there had to be a way to get to him. I leaned back, trying to keep my emotions in check. The last thing I needed was Norton, or worse, one of his lackeys like Harlow, sniffing around for why I suddenly cared about a hitman from a downstate prison. Tommy shifted again, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, Finch, I didn't come to you just to drop this on your lap. I know you've got friends in here, people who can pull strings. You help me out, and maybe we can figure out a way to deal with Jeffers." It was a proposition I hadn't expected, and I couldn't quite tell what Tommy wanted in return. He didn't seem like the typical manipulator, not like the men I'd come to know in Coldwater who bartered secrets, like cigarettes. But Tommy had something to gain. Everyone in this hellhole did. "What do you want?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. Tommy let out a shaky breath. "A way out. My case, it's a mess. They say I killed a man during a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't me, but the evidence, the witnesses, it doesn't look good. I need help, Finch. Legal help. And from what I hear, you've got the connections." He wasn't wrong. Over the years, thanks to my work with Norton and my growing reputation as someone who solved problems for the guards, I'd developed a few connections: lawyers, shady accountants, and even a judge or two who had been swept up in Coldwater's shadowy dealings. But pulling those strings wasn't without risk. Norton had eyes on me, and even though he kept me busy with his dirty financial work, I knew he was waiting for me to make a wrong move. If I asked for a favor or started meddling in something that drew too much attention, Norton would come down on me like a hammer. But Tommy's information was too valuable to ignore. I needed his help. More importantly, I needed to track down Jeffers. "I'll see what I can do," I said, my voice low. "But if I help you, you're not going to bail on me. You stick with this until we find out the truth." Tommy nodded eagerly, relief washing over his face. "I'm not going anywhere. You've got my word." We didn't shake hands. This wasn't the kind of place where deals were sealed that way. But the understanding was there. Tommy was in this with me now, for better or worse. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of the secret Tommy had shared began to grind on me. Every time I walked past Norton's office or saw Harlow lurking near the yard, I felt like they could sense the change in me. I hadn't told Red anything yet. He could see something was bothering me, though. Every time we sat across from each other in the common area, chessboard between us, I could feel his eyes on me, waiting for me to crack. But this wasn't just my secret to share. If I was going to take down Norton, or at least get out of Coldwater, I needed to play my cards close to the chest. Meanwhile, Norton's demands on me grew heavier. It wasn't just the money laundering anymore. He had expanded his operation, using the prison as a funnel for all kinds of illegal activity. Drugs, weapons, and even human trafficking, all of it passed through Coldwater. And I was right in the middle of it, whether I liked it or not. One night, as I sat in my cell going over the latest batch of records Norton had handed me, Red appeared at the bars. He leaned against the cold steel, his eyes searching mine in that way he did when he knew something was wrong but was waiting for me to speak. "You've been quiet," Red said. "That's not like you." I sighed, pushing the papers aside. "There's something I need to tell you." Red's eyes narrowed, and he stepped inside, sitting on the edge of the bed. "What's going on, Finch?" I didn't give him the full story. Not yet. But I told him enough. About Tommy, about the hitman Jeffers, about how it all connected to the murder of my wife. Red listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When I was done, he sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the floor. "If this is true," Red finally said, "then you've got a shot. A real shot." I nodded. "But I need more than a story. I need proof. And that's where it gets tricky." Red rubbed his chin, his brow furrowing in thought. "We can't get to Jeffers from in here. But there might be another way. I know a guy. Well, not exactly a guy. More like someone who knows people on the outside. People who can dig around, ask questions." "Who?" "They call him the Whisperer," Red said, his voice dropping as if speaking the name alone was dangerous. "He's been inside for decades, but his network goes far. He knows things even the warden doesn't know. But he's not cheap." Of course, nothing in Coldwater was. "What's he want?" I asked. Red gave me a grim look. "Depends on what you're asking. Some favors come with a heavy price. The kind of price that doesn't leave you breathing. It was a risk. A dangerous one. But if the Whisperer could get me information about Jeffers, it was a risk I was willing to take." "Can you arrange a meeting?" I asked. Red hesitated for just a second, then nodded. "I'll see what I can do." A week later, the meeting was set. The Whisperer wasn't what I expected. He was a short, wiry man with graying hair and sharp, darting eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. We met in the far corner of the exercise yard, a spot where the guards didn't bother patrolling as much, especially not when the Whisperer was involved. "I hear you've got a problem," the Whisperer said, his voice low and raspy, like sandpaper on stone. "I need information," I replied. "On a man named Jeffers. A hitman who framed me for my wife's murder." The Whisperer smirked, his thin lips pulling into a crooked grin. "You're not the first man to come to me with a tale like that. But lucky for you, I might know something about this Jeffers." My heart pounded in my chest. "What do you want in return?" He raised an eyebrow, considering me for a moment. "I'll think about that. You do me a favor when I call on you. That's how this works. No questions, no arguments. When the time comes, you do what I ask. Agreed?" I didn't have a choice. Not if I wanted a chance at the truth. "Agreed." The Whisperer nodded. "Good. I'll be in touch." The waiting was always the worst part. After meeting with the Whisperer, I had no choice but to keep going about my daily routine, knowing that at any moment, my fate could change. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for someone to decide whether to push you or pull you back to safety. Every sound, every glance from a guard or another inmate, felt like it carried a secret weight. And all I could do was wait. Red and I continued our chess games, but they were quieter now, both of us preoccupied with what lay ahead. Red had his own reasons for being nervous. He'd been around long enough to know that any deal with the Whisperer came with consequences, sometimes deadly ones. "You sure you're ready for this?" Red asked one afternoon as we played in the corner of the yard. His eyes were steady on the board, but I could feel the concern behind his words. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over a pawn. "I don't have a choice. If what Tommy told me is true, this might be my only shot at getting out of here." Red moved a knight forward, cutting off one of my pieces. "Just be careful. The Whisperer's not the kind of guy you want to owe favors to. He has a way of collecting that'll make you wish you hadn't asked in the first place." I knew Red was right, but I was too far in to turn back now. The thought of Jeffers somewhere out there, living free while I rotted away in Coldwater, gnawed at me like a festering wound. And with Norton's grip tightening on the prison's operations, it felt like my window of opportunity was closing fast. A week passed, then two. The pressure grew heavier with each day. I found myself watching Norton more closely, trying to anticipate his next move, while also keeping my head down with the work he gave me. I was deep into his financial dealings, so deep that if he ever suspected me of betrayal, I knew I wouldn't live to see the outside world. But then, one evening, the message came. It was delivered by a new inmate, a skinny kid who looked like he hadn't seen a proper meal in weeks. He passed me a folded scrap of paper while we were cleaning up after dinner, his hand shaking slightly as he did so. I stuffed the note into my pocket without a word and waited until I was alone in my cell to open it. The handwriting was tiny and precise, the kind of writing that told you the person behind it was meticulous. Dangerously so. Jeffers is real. Boston, as Tommy said. But he's under new management. Big people. He's not just a hitman anymore. You'll need help. Get ready. The favor I'll ask for is coming soon. Be prepared. No name. No signature. None needed. The Whisperer had done his part, and now I had to be ready to do mine. The next morning, I found Tommy in the yard, pacing nervously near the fence. He was jumpy, like a man who knew he was walking on thin ice and didn't know how to stop. When he saw me, he hurried over, glancing around as if expecting someone to be listening. "Did you hear anything?" Tommy asked, his voice a low whisper. I nodded. "Jeffers is real. He's in Boston, just like you said. But there's more to it. He's not working alone anymore. He's part of something bigger." Tommy swallowed hard, his face paling. "Bigger? What do you mean?" "I don't know yet. But the Whisperer says I'll need help. And he's going to ask for a favor soon." Tommy looked like he wanted to run, his eyes darting toward the gates. "I didn't sign up for this, Finch. I thought I was just giving you information, not getting involved in some kind of mafia thing." I grabbed his arm, holding him in place. "You're involved whether you like it or not. You brought me this, remember? You wanted my help. Now we're in it together." Tommy looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. But he didn't pull away. He knew, just as I did, that there was no backing out now. Days passed, and the tension continued to build. I kept expecting the Whisperer's favor to come any day, but no word arrived. Meanwhile, Norton was getting restless. He'd been pacing more in his office, grumbling about new regulations and audits from the state. He was under pressure, and it showed. Every interaction with him felt like walking on a knife's edge, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something gave. Then, one morning, the guards came for me. It wasn't unusual for them to call me to Norton's office. I'd become accustomed to it over the years. But something about this time felt different. Harlow was waiting for me by the cell door, his face grim. He didn't say a word as we walked through the halls, but I could feel the tension in the air. Something was off. When we reached Norton's office, I was ushered inside, and there he was, standing behind his desk with his hands clasped in front of him. His face was calm, too calm, like the surface of a still lake hiding something dangerous beneath. "Sit down, Finch," Norton said, his voice smooth but cold. I obeyed, lowering myself into the chair across from him, my stomach tightening with unease. "I've been hearing things," Norton began, his eyes fixed on mine. "About you. About how you've been making inquiries. Asking questions about people you shouldn't be concerned with." My heart skipped a beat. How had he found out? I'd been careful, hadn't said a word to anyone outside of Red and Tommy. But Coldwater had eyes everywhere, and it seemed I'd underestimated just how far Norton's reach extended. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Norton's smile was thin, humorless. "Don't insult my intelligence, Finch. I know everything that happens in this prison. Everything. And when one of my prisoners starts sniffing around in places that could jeopardize my business, I take notice." I forced myself to hold his gaze, refusing to flinch. "I'm just doing my job. The one you gave me." Norton leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Let me make one thing very clear. I don't care what you think you're going to find. I don't care who you think you're going to talk to. If you so much as breathe a word of my business outside these walls, you won't live to see the next sunrise. Do you understand me?" I nodded, my throat dry. "I understand." For a long moment, Norton stared at me, as if weighing whether or not to believe me. Then he leaned back, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Good. Now get out of my office." I stood, my legs shaky, and left without another word. As I walked back to my cell, my mind raced. Norton knew something was up. I didn't know how much he knew or how close he was to finding out about the Whisperer, but it was clear that my time was running out. That night, as I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something big. And when it did, I had to be ready. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, there was a soft knock on the bars of my cell. I sat up, my heart pounding, and saw Red standing there, his face lit by the dim glow of the hallway lights. "He's here," Red whispered. I didn't need to ask who he meant. The Whisperer's favor had finally come. The meeting took place in one of the old storage rooms beneath the prison, a place where the guards didn't bother to check anymore. The Whisperer was waiting for me when I arrived, his sharp eyes gleaming in the darkness. "You've been busy," he said, his voice low and quiet. "Norton's got his eye on you." "I know," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "What do you want from me?" The Whisperer stepped closer, his gaze intense. "There's a shipment coming in. Something important. Norton's using it to pay off some very powerful people. I need you to make sure it doesn't arrive." I blinked, taken aback. Sabotaging one of Norton's shipments? That was suicide. If Norton found out I was behind it, he'd have me killed before I even had a chance to explain myself. "I can't do that," I said, shaking my head. "Norton's already suspicious of me. If I interfere with his business, I'm dead." The Whisperer's expression didn't change. "You asked for my help? This is the price. You either do this, or everything you've worked for, everything you want, disappears. And so do you." I stared at him, my mind racing. This was it. The favor. The moment I'd been dreading. And there was no way out. "Fine," I said through gritted teeth. "I'll do it." The Whisperer nodded, satisfied. "Good. You'll get the details soon. Be ready." The next few days were a blur. Every step I took, every conversation I had, felt like a countdown ticking towards something inevitable. Red could sense it too. He'd warned me again about the Whisperer's favors, but by now. The cold October wind rattled through the cracked windows of the storage room beneath the prison. I could feel its bite as I waited in the shadows, tension coiling tight in my gut. The shipment was supposed to come in tonight, and the Whisperer's favor weighed on me like a lead vest. The details had come just as promised, slipped into my hand in the form of a crumpled napkin during dinner. The instructions were simple: stop the truck before it reached Norton's contact inside Coldwater. I didn't know what the shipment contained, and part of me didn't want to. Drugs, weapons, maybe even people, it didn't matter. All I knew was that if Norton found out I was involved in this, I wouldn't live long enough to see what came next. Red had warned me not to go through with it, had practically begged me to reconsider. "This is suicide, Finch," he'd said, his voice low and urgent. "Norton's already breathing down your neck. If you pull this off, he'll know it was you." But there was no backing out. The Whisperer had made that clear. I was in too deep, and the only way forward was through. The plan was simple enough. The truck would pull up near the loading dock around midnight, where Norton's men would be waiting to receive the shipment. My job was to delay it, just long enough for the Whisperer's people to swoop in and take whatever they needed before it reached the prison. It sounded easy on paper, but in Coldwater, nothing was ever easy. I shifted in the shadows, my eyes scanning the darkened hallway leading to the dock. The guards were sparse this time of night, but there were always eyes watching. I had to be quick. The clock was ticking. The truck arrived right on time. I saw its headlights cut through the mist as it rumbled down the back road leading to the loading bay. Two figures, Norton's men, no doubt, emerged from the side door to greet it. They looked relaxed, casual, like this was just another routine drop. But I wasn't alone. In the darkness, hidden from view, were the Whisperer's men, waiting for my signal. They weren't prisoners, at least not in the traditional sense. These were outsiders, people who worked for the network the Whisperer controlled. How they'd gotten in or what kind of deal had been made to allow their presence here, I didn't know. All I knew was that they were here to make sure this operation went off without a hitch. The truck slowed to a stop, and the driver, a burly man with a thick beard and a leather jacket, stepped out. I watched from my hiding spot as he exchanged a few words with Norton's men, probably just checking to make sure everything was in order before unloading the shipment. This was my moment. I moved silently from the shadows, slipping through the back corridor that ran parallel to the dock. The trick was to make it look like an accident, something that would delay them just long enough without raising too much suspicion. The Whisperer's men would take care of the rest. As I approached the control panel for the dock's gate, my heart pounded in my chest. One wrong move and this could all go sideways. My hand hovered over the emergency stop button. All it would take was a single push, and the loading gate would freeze. The truck wouldn't be able to unload, and Norton's men would have no choice but to scramble for a solution. With a deep breath, I pressed the button. The gate shuddered to a halt. I could hear the men outside cursing as they realized something was wrong. One of them banged on the metal door, shouting for someone to fix the damn thing. I slipped back into the shadows, my heart racing. Now it was up to the Whisperer's men. The minutes that followed felt like hours. I stayed hidden, watching as Norton's men tried to figure out what had gone wrong. One of them called for backup, a guard who had been stationed nearby. But before he could arrive, the dark figures emerged from the mist, the Whisperer's crew. They moved swiftly, silently, overwhelming the two guards in seconds. The driver barely had time to react before he was yanked from the truck and shoved to the ground. The whole scene played out in eerie silence, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I couldn't see exactly what the Whisperer's men were after, but it didn't take long for them to find it. They pulled several large crates from the back of the truck, loading them into an unmarked van that had appeared out of nowhere. Within minutes, the shipment was gone, and the Whisperer's men vanished into the night as quickly as they had come. It was over. The truck was empty, the dock quiet except for the groans of the guards, who were left lying unconscious in the dirt. I stepped back into the corridor, my hands shaking. It had worked. I had done my part, and now the Whisperer owed me. But the victory felt hollow. I knew that the real danger hadn't even begun. The next morning, the prison buzzed with rumors. Word of the stolen shipment spread like wildfire, and it wasn't long before Norton got wind of it. I kept my head down, going through the motions of my day, but I could feel the tension building, like a storm about to break. It wasn't until lunch that things came to a head. I was sitting with Red in the mess hall when the doors slammed open, and Norton stormed in, flanked by two guards. His face was a mask of barely contained fury, his eyes scanning the room like a predator hunting its prey. For a split second, I thought he was coming for me, that somehow he had already figured out my involvement. But instead, he made a beeline for Tommy. I watched, my heart sinking, as Norton grabbed Tommy by the collar and hauled him out of his seat. The entire mess hall went silent, every inmate watching as the warden dragged Tommy toward the exit. "You think you can play games with me?" Norton snarled, his voice low but deadly. "You think I wouldn't find out?" Tommy's eyes were wide with terror, his mouth moving but no words coming out. I stood up, my instincts screaming at me to do something, but Red grabbed my arm, pulling me back down. "Don't," Red hissed under his breath. "You can't help him now." Norton and his men disappeared through the doors, taking Tommy with them. The room slowly returned to its usual murmur of conversation, but I couldn't focus. I knew what was coming. Tommy had been my informant. Norton must have suspected him first, and now Tommy was as good as dead. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in my bunk, my mind racing with guilt and fear. Tommy had been caught in the crossfire of something far bigger than either of us, and now he was paying the price. The hours dragged on, and eventually I heard footsteps outside my cell. I sat up, expecting the worst, but it wasn't a guard or Norton. It was Red. He stepped inside, his face grim. "They found him," Red said quietly. "Tommy?" Red nodded, his eyes dark. "In the infirmary. He's alive, but barely. Norton's men worked him over good. He won't last long." I felt sick. I had dragged Tommy into this mess, and now he was suffering for it. "I've got to see him," I said, standing up. Red shook his head. "No. It's too dangerous. If Norton finds out you're involved, he'll come for you next." "I don't care," I snapped. "I have to talk to him." Red didn't argue. He knew as well as I did that this might be my only chance to find out what Tommy knew, and maybe, just maybe, make things right. The infirmary was quiet when I slipped in, the faint smell of antiseptic hanging in the air. Tommy lay in a bed near the back, his face swollen and bruised, his breathing labored. He looked like he had aged 20 years in a single night. I approached slowly, my footsteps barely making a sound. Tommy's eyes fluttered open as I reached his bedside. He looked at me, recognition flickering in his gaze, but he didn't speak. His lips were cracked and bloodied, and I could tell just by looking at him that he didn't have much time left. "Tommy," I whispered, leaning close. "I'm sorry. I didn't think." He shook his head, a weak motion that stopped me mid-sentence. His hand twitched, reaching for mine, and I took it gently. With a great effort, Tommy rasped, "Norton, he knows, more than you think." "What do you mean?" I asked urgently. Tommy's chest heaved with the effort of breathing. "There's someone inside." His voice was barely audible, each word a struggle. "Feeding him everything." Someone inside. My mind raced. Someone close to me, someone who knew about the Whisperer, about the shipment, about everything. "Who?" I asked, my heart pounding in my ears. "Who is it?" Tommy's grip on my hand tightened briefly, his eyes widening in fear. Before he could answer, the door to the infirmary creaked open. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. The door creaked open slowly, casting a long shadow across the infirmary floor. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest, as I turned to see who it was. For a brief moment, I thought it might be Norton or one of his goons, ready to finish what they started with Tommy. But when the figure stepped into the dim light, I was met with a familiar face, Dr. Halston, the prison physician. His gaze swept the room, and when his eyes landed on me, a flicker of surprise crossed his features. He hesitated, then nodded toward Tommy. "I should have known you'd come," he said, his voice low and rough. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his shoulders sagging under the weight of a burden I didn't fully understand. "I'm here to see my friend," I said, keeping my tone neutral, though my mind was racing. I didn't know if I could trust Halston. He worked for Norton, after all, but I didn't have much of a choice. I had to stay with Tommy. "Your friend," Halston echoed, his eyes narrowing as he approached Tommy's bed. He checked Tommy's pulse, frowning at what he found, though I already knew what he would say. Tommy wasn't going to make it. "He won't last the night," Halston muttered, almost to himself, before turning back to me. "I'll leave you for now, Finch. Just be careful what you do next. You're stepping on thin ice." His words hung in the air as he turned and left, the door clicking shut softly behind him. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Tommy's hand twitched in mine, pulling me back to the moment. His breathing was ragged, each shallow inhale a fight. I leaned closer, desperate to hear the name, the one who was feeding information to Norton, the one who had betrayed us all. But Tommy's eyes were unfocused now, his mind drifting somewhere far away. His grip on my hand weakened, and I knew I was losing him. "Tommy," I whispered urgently. "Who is it? Who's the inside man?" His lips moved, barely a whisper escaping. I leaned in as close as I could, straining to hear. "Red," he rasped, and then, with one final shuddering breath, Tommy was gone. I stumbled back, the name ringing in my ears. Red? It couldn't be. Red had been my ally, my friend, the one person I thought I could trust in this place. The thought that he might have been playing me all along made my stomach twist in knots. But Tommy had no reason to lie, not on his deathbed. If he said Red was the one feeding Norton information, then it had to be true. For a few minutes, I stood there, staring at Tommy's lifeless body, trying to piece it all together. The man who'd brought me in, who had connected me to the Whisperer, had been working for Norton this entire time. Everything started to make sense. The way Red always seemed to know things he shouldn't have, the way he tried to warn me off of this plan, the way he'd been reluctant to get too close to the Whisperer's people. He'd been playing both sides, feeding Norton enough to keep himself in the Warden's good graces while staying just close enough to me to keep tabs on my every move. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd been manipulated, used, and now I had a target on my back bigger than ever. Red had sold me out, and for what? To keep himself safe? Or was there something more? I knew I couldn't stay in the infirmary much longer. Tommy's death would raise questions, and if anyone found me here, it would only make things worse. I slipped out the back, my mind spinning with possibilities. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. The prison was quieter than usual that night. Even the guards seemed subdued, like they could sense something brewing just beneath the surface. I moved through the halls with purpose, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the watchful eyes of anyone who might recognize me. I had one goal: find Red. I found him sitting at one of our usual tables in the rec room, playing solitaire with a worn-out deck of cards. He didn't look up as I approached, his expression calm, almost bored. But I knew better now. That calm exterior hid a man who had been manipulating events behind the scenes for God knows how long. "Red," I said, my voice low and cold. He looked up slowly, his eyes meeting mine with that same unreadable expression. For a moment, neither of us said anything, the silence between us thick with tension. "Something on your mind, Finch?" he asked casually, flipping another card over. But there was something in his voice, an edge, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "You tell me," I said, taking a step closer. I could feel my pulse quickening, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "Tommy's dead. Norton's men got to him." Red paused, his hand hovering over the cards. He didn't look surprised, didn't even blink. "That's so?" he muttered. I slammed my hand down on the table, sending the cards scattering across the floor. "He told me something before he died, Red. He told me you've been feeding Norton information. That you've been playing me." For the first time, Red's mask slipped. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. "You shouldn't believe everything you hear, Finch," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Especially from a dead man. Is it true?" I demanded, my fists clenched at my sides. "Have you been working with Norton this whole time?" Red stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. For a moment, I thought he might deny it, might try to talk his way out of it like he always did. But instead, he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I didn't have a choice," he said quietly, his eyes meeting mine. "You think I wanted this? You think I enjoyed selling you out, watching Norton tighten the noose around your neck? I did what I had to do to survive, Finch. That's all any of us are doing in here." I felt a cold, sinking feeling in my stomach. "You could have told me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You could have warned me, instead of leading me into this trap." Red shook his head. "You were in too deep, Finch. Even if I had warned you, it wouldn't have mattered. Norton had his eye on you from the moment you walked through those gates. The Whisperer? He's nothing compared to Norton's reach. You think you're part of some big plan, but you're just another pawn in his game." His words hit me like a slap in the face. I'd been so focused on the Whisperer, so convinced that I was playing a part in something bigger than myself. But in reality, I was just another cog in Norton's machine. "I'm sorry, Finch," Red said quietly, genuine regret in his voice. "But in here, you do what you have to do to survive. And if that means making a deal with the devil, well, that's the price you pay." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to lash out, to scream at Red for betraying me. But another part of me understood. This place changed people, twisted them into something unrecognizable. Red had made his choice, just like I had made mine. "What now?" I asked finally, my voice hollow. "What happens next?" Red didn't answer right away. He glanced around the room, as if making sure no one else was listening, before leaning in close. "You've got two options, Finch," he said quietly. "You can keep fighting, keep trying to outsmart Norton and the Whisperer and everyone else who's playing this game. Or you can get out." "Get out?" I repeated, confused. "What are you talking about?" Red's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to me. "There's a way out of this, Finch. A way out of Coldwater, out of this whole damn nightmare. But you're going to need my help." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A way out of Coldwater? It seemed impossible, but then again, so much about this place was impossible. If Red was telling the truth, if there was really a way out. "What's the catch?" I asked, my voice laced with suspicion. Red gave a small, bitter smile. "The catch is, you're going to have to trust me again." Trust. That was the last thing I wanted to give Red after everything he'd done, after everything he'd kept from me. But if what he was saying was true, if there really was a way out of this hellhole, then maybe I didn't have a choice. "Fine," I said after a long pause. "But you're going to have to tell me everything." Red nodded, the tension in his posture easing slightly. "Meet me in the yard tomorrow night," he said quietly. "After lights out. I'll explain everything then." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my mind spinning with questions and doubts. Could I really trust Red after everything? Or was this just another one of his games, another trap waiting to snap shut? The following day passed in a haze. My mind was racing, caught in a tug of war between doubt and desperation. I tried to go about my usual routine, eating the tasteless gruel they served us, avoiding the watchful eyes of the guards, keeping my head low. But the idea that Red might be leading me into another trap gnawed at my insides. Still, the possibility of escape, no matter how slim, was enough to keep me going. By the time night fell, my nerves were shot. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the hours until lights out. When the moment finally came, I slipped out of my cell as quietly as possible, moving like a shadow through the darkened corridors. Every footstep echoed ominously in the silence, and I half expected Norton's thugs to jump out from behind every corner. When I reached the yard, the air was thick with tension. The stars above were faint and distant, barely visible through the haze of the prison's floodlights. Red was already there, standing near the far wall, hands in his pockets, his face obscured in shadow. As I approached, he glanced up, his expression unreadable. "You came," he said quietly, as if there had ever been any doubt. "I said I would," I replied, my voice flat. My heart was pounding in my chest, a mixture of anger, fear, and anticipation swirling inside me. "Now tell me, what's this way out you've been talking about?" Red motioned for me to follow him to a more secluded corner of the yard, out of sight from the guards and the towers. Once there, he lowered his voice to a near whisper. "It's not going to be easy," he began, his eyes scanning the walls, as if expecting someone to be listening in. "But it's possible. There's a tunnel, a service tunnel, that runs beneath the prison. It was built years ago, part of the old infrastructure, before Coldwater became the fortress it is now. Most of the staff doesn't even know it exists." I crossed my arms, trying to remain skeptical. "And how do you know about it?" "I've been here a long time, Finch," Red replied, his voice tinged with a mixture of bitterness and pride. "I've seen things. Heard things. There are cracks in this place if you know where to look." "A tunnel?" I repeated, the words sounding almost absurd in the context of Coldwater's high walls and razor wire. "How do you know it leads outside?" Red hesitated, glancing away for a moment. "I've been down there," he said finally. "Years ago, when I still had a bit of fight left in me. It's not a straight shot, but it leads to an old drainage system that empties out past the outer wall. The problem is, it's been sealed off, reinforced with concrete. But there's a weak spot, a section they didn't reinforce properly. If we can get to that spot, we can break through." My mind was racing, trying to process everything. It sounded impossible, like something out of a bad prison escape movie. And yet, there was something in Red's voice, something in the way he laid out the plan that made me believe, even for a moment, that it might work. "How do we get into the tunnel?" I asked, my voice low. Red leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "There's an access point in the basement beneath the old laundry room. It's been abandoned for years, but the hatch is still there. We'll need to get past the guards, down through the boiler room, and into the basement. Once we're in, we'll have a small window before the shift change." The more he spoke, the more my mind started to piece the plan together. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was better than sitting in my cell waiting for Norton to finish me off. "There's something you need to know, though," Red said, his tone suddenly grave. "Norton isn't the only problem. The Whisperer's men, they know something's up. They've been watching us. If they find out about this, they'll try to stop us. They'll kill us before we even get a chance to try." I clenched my jaw, my thoughts flickering back to Tommy. He hadn't just been a victim of Norton's greed, he'd been caught in the crossfire of a power struggle that was much bigger than I'd realized. "I've handled worse," I muttered, more to myself than to Red. "What do we need?" Red sighed, his gaze drifting to the distant guard tower where the searchlights swept lazily across the yard. "Tools, supplies. We'll need a distraction, something to keep the guards busy while we make our move." "A distraction?" I repeated. "Like what?" Red glanced at me, a flicker of something dark passing through his eyes. "A riot, Finch. A full-blown riot." I blinked, taken aback. "A riot?" It was one thing to slip through the shadows and find a tunnel, but starting a riot in cold water? That was a whole other level of chaos. A riot would mean violence, bloodshed, innocent men getting caught in the middle. "Are you out of your mind?" I hissed, keeping my voice low. "We'll get killed before we even make it to the basement." "Maybe," Red admitted, his voice calm, almost detached. "But it's the only way we're going to get enough time. The guards will be too busy putting down the riot to notice two men slipping into the basement. It's the only chance we've got." I stared at him, trying to gauge if he was serious. But of course he was. Red was always serious, even when he was walking me straight into the fire. "So, what's the plan?" I asked, my voice quieter now, resigned to the madness. Red leaned in closer. "We set it off during rec time tomorrow. There's a group, the Breakers. They've been itching for a fight with the guards. All we have to do is give them a reason. Once it starts, it'll spread like wildfire. We just need to slip away in the chaos." I nodded slowly, though every instinct in my body was screaming that this was suicide. A riot, a tunnel, breaking through concrete. It was the kind of thing that only worked in stories, not in real life. But real life hadn't exactly been kind to me lately, and this was the best shot I had. "What about Norton?" I asked, my voice dropping even lower. "He'll know something's up. If he catches wind of this." "He won't," Red cut me off. "He's too busy with his own games. He thinks he has control of everything, but he's blind to what's happening right under his nose." I wasn't so sure about that, but I didn't argue. Norton had spies everywhere, men who owed him everything, and I had no doubt he'd have eyes on us the moment things started going sideways. But Red was right about one thing: Norton was arrogant. He didn't see us as a threat. Not yet. "So, it's all set then?" I asked, feeling the weight of the decision settle over me. Red nodded. "Tomorrow night. We move fast, no hesitation. Once the riot starts, we get to the basement, find the tunnel, and break through. If we're lucky, we'll be outside before anyone realizes we're gone." Lucky. I hadn't felt lucky in a long time, but maybe it was time to take a gamble. What was the worst that could happen? I'd already lost everything. There was nothing left for me here except cold concrete and steel bars. The next day crawled by in agonizing slow motion. Every glance, every whisper from the other inmates felt like it could be the spark that set everything off. I could feel the tension in the air, a heavy, suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. The guards were on edge too, though they tried to hide it. They always knew when trouble was coming, But this time, they didn't know just how close it was. By the time rec hour rolled around, my palms were sweating, my heart hammering in my chest like a caged animal. I spotted Red across the yard, giving me a barely perceptible nod. The breakers were gathered nearby, looking restless, their eyes flicking toward the guards with barely concealed hatred. All it would take was one spark. And then it happened. One of the breakers, a hulking brute named Cutter, shoved a guard hard. The guard stumbled, barking a warning, but Cutter didn't back down. He swung, landing a punch square in the guard's face, and in an instant, the yard erupted into chaos. Fists flew, men shouted, guards rushed in with batons, and the sound of bodies colliding filled the air. I glanced at Red, who motioned for me to move. This was it. Our chance. We slipped through the chaos, dodging bodies and ducking under the melee as we made our way toward the far side of the yard. The guards were too busy trying to contain the riot to notice us slipping away. We reached the door to the basement, my heart pounding in my throat. Red yanked it open, and we descended into the darkness below. But as we reached the bottom of the stairs, something stopped me dead in my tracks. A figure was waiting for us, standing in the shadows, arms crossed. A cold, familiar voice echoed in the dimly lit space. "Going somewhere, Finch?" It was Norton. Norton stood in the shadows, arms crossed, a smug smile creeping across his face like a predator savoring the final moments before the kill. Behind him, two of his men, brutal enforcers I'd seen many times breaking the will of others, blocked the hallway. The light overhead flickered ominously, casting long shadows across the grimy basement walls. For a moment, the air was too thick to breathe, my chest tight with the realization that we'd been caught. Red, standing next to me, kept his face calm, his eyes locked on Norton. But I could see the slight twitch in his hand, the only sign of tension breaking through his practiced facade. Red had warned me that Norton would have spies, but I hadn't expected him to show up himself. Norton chuckled, the sound low and cold. "You know, Finch, I always knew you were stupid enough to try something like this. But Red here, I thought he was smarter. I guess even the wise men break eventually." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stand straight, trying to think of something, anything that could save us. My mind raced, running through 1,000 different scenarios, but none of them ended well. We were trapped, deep in the belly of Coldwater, and Norton had us exactly where he wanted us. "What's the play here, Finch?" Norton continued, stepping forward, the heels of his boots clicking ominously against the concrete floor. "Run off into the night? Maybe hide out in the woods like some kind of fugitive? You think you'll get far before they find you? You think this place just lets people slip away?" Red, ever calm in the face of danger, took a step forward. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of someone who had survived too much to be intimidated anymore. "What do you want, Norton? You're not here just to gloat." Norton smirked, but I caught the flicker of something in his eyes, annoyance, maybe, that Red wasn't crumbling like so many before him had. "What I want," Norton said slowly, as though he were explaining something simple to a child, "is to make sure this prison stays exactly the way it is. And I want to make sure that people like you," he pointed a finger at us, "know their place." He circled around us slowly, his two men staying perfectly still, like wolves waiting for the alpha to give the signal. "You thought I wouldn't notice, didn't you? The little whispers, the secret meetings, the alliances you've been forming. I've been running this place for a long time, boys. You think you're the first to dream of getting out? Think you're the first to try?" I glanced at Red, who still hadn't broken eye contact with Norton. For a second, it looked like Red might be calculating something, looking for a way out. But then Norton's next words cut through the silence. "Here's the thing," Norton said, stepping close enough that I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. "You've got two choices right now. You can go back to your cell, let this little riot blow over, and pretend like this never happened. Maybe I even make things a little easier for you." Or his eyes darkened. "You can keep going down this path, and I promise you, I'll make you disappear into this prison so deep, you'll forget what daylight looks like." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle between us. The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I knew what Norton was capable of. I'd seen men vanish without a trace before, swallowed up by the system, erased from existence. No one questioned it. No one cared. Coldwater was a machine, and Norton was the one who fed it. But there was something else, something unspoken lingering in Norton's words. His fear. He was afraid of something, maybe not me, maybe not even Red, but afraid that the cracks in his perfect system were beginning to show. Afraid that his control over this prison wasn't as absolute as he wanted everyone to believe. Red, as always, was the first to speak. "And if we don't go back?" he asked, his voice steady. Norton's eyes narrowed, his smirk fading just slightly. "Then I make an example of you," he said flatly. "I put you both in a hole so deep, no one will ever hear from you again." My throat was dry, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. We were trapped. The plan, Red's whole careful, brilliant plan, was unraveling right in front of us. Norton had the power here, and no amount of cleverness could change that. At least, not now. But Red didn't flinch. He didn't even look scared, which was unnerving in its own way. Instead, he turned his gaze back to me, his expression unreadable. I couldn't tell if he was asking for my opinion, or if he had already decided what we were going to do. "What's it gonna be, Finch?" Norton asked, his voice almost bored now, as though he were offering a choice between two equally insignificant outcomes. "You're not stupid. You know how this ends." I took a deep breath, trying to push past the fear clawing at my insides. I knew Red wouldn't go back. That wasn't in him. The question was whether I could follow him down this path, knowing full well where it might lead. Could I walk back to my cell and accept the fate Norton was offering, quiet survival, at the cost of my soul, or did I take the risk, step into the unknown, and keep fighting? Norton's men were still standing silently behind him, ready to pounce if we so much as breathed wrong. They were biding their time, waiting for the order to snap our necks or drag us off into the dark. But there was something Norton hadn't accounted for. Something he didn't know. The riot above. The prison was still in chaos. The breakers were still at war with the guards, and Coldwater was burning from the inside. If we didn't take our shot now, we might never get another chance. I met Red's eyes again, and in that moment I saw it, the fire that had never really gone out. Red wasn't scared. He wasn't broken. He was still fighting, and he wasn't going to stop. And I realized neither was I. I turned back to Norton, my fists clenched at my sides. "We're not going back." Norton's smile faltered, just for a split second. Then it came back, wider and colder. "That's a shame, Finch. I had high hopes for you." He motioned to his men, who started forward, their expressions dark and focused. I could feel the tension in the air thickening, my heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. But just as they were about to grab us, a deafening noise echoed from above. A loud crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of something exploding. The riot had escalated, and whatever was happening up there, it was spiraling out of control. Norton froze, his head snapping upward as the noise grew louder. His men hesitated, unsure whether to carry out his orders or go see what was happening above. The sound of boots on concrete reverberated from the stairs behind us. More guards, rushing down to deal with whatever fresh hell had just broken loose. In that split second of confusion, Red acted. He lunged forward, grabbing a piece of broken pipe that had been lying on the ground. In one fluid motion, he swung it at Norton's men, catching one of them across the head with a sickening thud. The man crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The other guard staggered back, caught off guard by the sudden attack. I didn't have time to think. Instinct took over, and I threw myself at the second guard, tackling him to the ground. We wrestled for control, my fists flying, adrenaline making every punch feel like it carried the weight of my entire life behind it. The guard struggled, but I managed to pin him down, delivering a blow that left him dazed. Norton, still reeling from the chaos, backed away, his face pale with shock. He hadn't expected us to fight back. He hadn't expected us to win. But we weren't done yet. Red and I stood over the unconscious guards, panting, our hearts racing. The sounds of the riot continued to rage above us, but for a moment, everything felt still, as if we were standing on the edge of something irreversible. Norton was cornered now, his eyes darting between us and the stairs. I could see the fear in his face, the realization that for once, he wasn't the one in control. "You think this changes anything?" Norton spat, his voice shaking with anger. "You think you can get away from me?" Red stepped forward, his expression cold, resolute. "You're already done, Norton," he said quietly. "You just don't know it yet." Before Norton could respond, more footsteps echoed down the stairwell, guards, responding to the riot. We didn't have time to finish this. Not yet. Red grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the tunnel hatch. "Come on," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to move now." I glanced back at Norton, who was already reaching for the radio at his belt, his face twisted in fury. There was no time to argue. The tunnel was colder than I remembered, the air thick with the stench of damp earth and the distant, acrid smell of smoke wafting down from the riot still raging above. Our footsteps echoed in the narrow passageway, a reminder that time was running out. The narrow beams of our flashlights cut through the darkness, casting shadows on the crumbling stone walls as we hurried deeper into the labyrinth beneath Coldwater. Red led the way, his movements quick but controlled. Every step felt like we were inching closer to the point of no return. My heart hammered in my chest, the adrenaline from the fight still coursing through my veins. The image of Norton's face, twisted in fury, but laced with fear, played over and over in my mind. We had crossed a line, one there was no coming back from. For years, Red had been planning this moment, working quietly, gathering information, biding his time. But even he hadn't accounted for this. A full-scale riot, Norton hunting us down, and the clock ticking louder with every second. There was no way to know how long the chaos upstairs would last, but I could feel it in my bones. Whatever was happening above was spiraling out of control. "Keep up," Red called over his shoulder, his voice low but sharp. "We need to get to the river before they regroup." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. My body was aching from the fight, my knuckles raw, bruises already forming where the guard had landed a few punches. But it didn't matter. The pain barely registered over the overwhelming sense of urgency. The tunnel twisted and turned, its uneven floor forcing us to stumble at times. It had been dug decades ago, during a time when the prison's underground system had been designed for maintenance. It was long abandoned, forgotten by most. But Red had discovered it early on, while doing his usual recon. I remember how he'd explained it to me one night, laying out the blueprints he had smuggled in piece by piece. It was our escape route, our last resort. But even the best plans can fall apart. We rounded a corner, and Red came to an abrupt stop, causing me to nearly slam into him. He crouched down, shining his light on the rusted, iron grate that marked the end of the tunnel. Beyond it was the narrow drainage canal that led to the river. From there, we could follow the water downstream, out of Coldwater's shadow and into the wilderness beyond. Red knelt by the grate, inspecting it closely. "Looks like it's still solid," he muttered, running his hand along the rusted bars. "Let's hope the bolts give." He pulled out a makeshift tool from his pocket, a rusted screwdriver with the handle wrapped in duct tape, and began working on the bolts. They were old, caked in grime, and rusted to the point where they looked more like relics than functioning pieces of the prison's infrastructure. I crouched beside him, watching as he worked with a focused intensity, his face tight with concentration. The sound of the riot, though muffled by the walls and layers of dirt above, still seeped down through the tunnel. Distant explosions, the crackle of gunfire, and the faint, almost ghostly, echoes of shouting prisoners filled the silence between us. Whatever was happening upstairs wasn't just a riot, it was a war zone. Coldwater was falling apart at the seams, and Norton was losing control of everything. Red cursed under his breath as the first bolt refused to budge. He leaned back, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "They're not giving," he said, his voice tight with frustration. I moved closer, trying to get a better look. The bolts were rusted beyond recognition, as if they had fused with the metal grate itself. Panic started to rise in my chest. This was the only way out, the only path that led beyond the walls of Coldwater. If we couldn't get through. "We don't have time for this," I whispered, the urgency creeping into my voice. "We need to move. They'll be on us any minute." Red's jaw tightened. He knew I was right, but he wasn't ready to give up just yet. He gripped the screwdriver harder, jamming it into the next bolt and twisting with all his strength. For a moment it looked like it might give. There was a small creak as the rusted metal shifted slightly. But then, with a sharp snap, the screwdriver slipped, and Red fell backward. "Damn it!" Red shouted, his voice bouncing off the tunnel walls. I stood up, pacing back and forth, my mind racing. "There's got to be another way," I muttered, half to myself. "Another exit, something." But I knew there wasn't. Red had scouted this place for years. This was the only way out, the only path that wasn't guarded or blocked. And we were running out of time. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from deeper in the tunnel, the unmistakable sound of boots pounding against the stone floor. Red and I exchanged a glance. Norton's men. They had found us. Red's eyes darted toward the grate one last time, and I could see the desperation in his expression. But then, something shifted in him, a calm acceptance settling over his features. He stood up slowly, dusting off his hands, and turned to face me. "Finch," he said, his voice low but steady, "we're not getting out through here. We need to go back." I stared at him, disbelief flooding my system. "Go back? Are you crazy? Norton's waiting for us." Red shook his head. "Not back to Norton. Back into the prison." I blinked, confusion clouding my mind. "Why would we?" But Red was already moving, grabbing my arm and pulling me away from the grate. "The riot," he said, urgency back in his voice. "It's the only thing keeping us alive right now. The guards are spread too thin. We need to get lost in the chaos." I didn't want to believe him. Everything in me screamed to keep pushing forward, to break through that grate no matter the cost. But deep down, I knew he was right. There was no time. If we stayed here, Norton's men would find us, and they'd drag us back into the pit or worse. I nodded, my throat tight. "Lead the way." We turned and sprinted back through the tunnel, retracing our steps as fast as we could. The sound of the approaching guards grew louder, the echoes of their boots bouncing off the walls, but we were moving faster now, driven by pure survival instinct. As we neared the exit that led back into the prison proper, I could hear the riot more clearly. The sounds of violence and chaos had intensified, screams, shouts, and the crackle of gunfire all blending together into a cacophony of destruction. Whatever had started as a small uprising had now consumed the entire prison. We emerged from the tunnel into a narrow, forgotten hallway, the lights flickering ominously above us. The air was thick with smoke, and the smell of burning wood and plastic stung my nostrils. Somewhere nearby, a fire was raging out of control. Red didn't slow down. He pushed forward, leading us through a series of winding corridors and hidden passages, places I had never even known existed. It was like the prison had transformed into a labyrinth, a nightmare maze where every turn brought new dangers. We finally burst out into the main cell block, and the sight that greeted us was nothing short of apocalyptic. The cell doors were wide open, and prisoners roamed free, many of them armed with makeshift weapons, shivs, pipes, even pieces of broken furniture. Fires blazed in several corners of the block, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The guards, what few remained, were fighting a losing battle, struggling to maintain order in the chaos. Red grabbed my shoulder, pulling me into the shadows before anyone could spot us. "Stay low," he hissed. "We need to blend in." I nodded, crouching down as we moved through the chaos. We stayed close to the walls, avoiding eye contact, avoiding the fights that had broken out between prisoners and guards alike. It was as if the very structure of Coldwater was crumbling, its iron grip on the men inside finally breaking under the weight of years of pent-up rage. In the distance, I saw a group of breakers, wild-eyed, desperate men who had been waiting for a chance like this. They were tearing through the guards with savage brutality, their leader barking orders as they moved through the block like a pack of wolves. I prayed they wouldn't see us. As we navigated through the wreckage of Coldwater, Red's eyes darted around, searching for something. It took me a moment to realize what he was looking for. An exit. But there were none. Every door was locked down, every window barricaded. The riot had consumed the prison, and there was no way out. Not yet. We pressed forward, deeper into the chaos, the sounds of destruction all around us. I could feel the heat from the fires licking at my skin, the smoke burning in my lungs. This was madness. Total, unrestrained madness. And yet, somehow, Red stayed calm. Somehow, he kept moving forward. Because Red wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was trying to win. The inferno of Coldwater raged like a beast, its tendrils of fire crawling up the walls, consuming everything in its path. The riot was now a full-blown insurrection. Prisoners tore through the cell blocks with wild, reckless abandon, seizing the momentary freedom as if it were their last breath of air. The guards, overwhelmed and outnumbered, had lost control. Gunshots rang out, metal clanged, and screams echoed down the halls, painting the scene like something out of a nightmare. But Red was as steady as ever, moving through the chaos with a strange sense of purpose. It was as if he had planned for this, every twist and turn, every hidden passageway we slipped through. He was leading me deeper into the prison, away from the main corridors where the worst of the fighting was taking place. We kept our heads down, slipping through the shadows, barely noticed by the inmates and guards locked in brutal combat. The smoke was thick now, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of us. But Red knew where he was going. He always knew. I was about to ask him what the plan was, where the hell we were headed, when he suddenly veered to the right and ducked into a narrow hallway that seemed untouched by the madness outside. The air was cooler here, the smoke thinner. For the first time in what felt like hours, the sound of chaos faded, leaving only the echo of our footsteps. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice low, barely above a whisper. Red didn't answer right away. He glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one had followed us, then turned back to face me. "We're almost there," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "Trust me, Finch. It's the only way out now." Out. That word hung in the air between us like a lifeline. I wanted to believe him. Hell, I needed to believe him. But everything about this prison, everything about Coldwater, told me there was no way out. Not really. Red seemed to read the doubt on my face. He stepped closer, his eyes hard. "You think I've spent all these years planning for nothing? You think I didn't have a backup for when things went sideways?" "Sideways?" I shot back. "The whole damn prison's burning down, Red. We're past sideways." Red smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Exactly. And that's why we have to move now. Norton's locked up tight in his office, probably waiting for the National Guard to come in and put this whole place under siege. But I'm not giving him that chance." Before I could press him for more, Red was on the move again, leading me further down the hallway. It was eerily quiet now, the walls lined with old filing cabinets and storage rooms that had been long forgotten by the rest of the prison. We passed a few doors, each one locked tight, before Red finally stopped in front of a heavy iron door at the far end of the hall. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. It didn't look like anything special, just another locked door in a prison full of them. But the way Red stood in front of it, the way his hand hovered over the handle as if this was the moment he had been waiting for all along, told me there was more to it than I could see. "Help me with this," Red said, snapping me out of my thoughts. Together, we shoved the old iron door, which groaned in protest but eventually gave way, revealing a dark stairwell leading down into the depths of the prison. The air that rushed up from below was damp and stale, carrying the faint smell of mold and decay. It was colder, too, like the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and never left. "Where does this go?" I asked, my voice echoing slightly in the stairwell. Red flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Old tunnel system," he said. "Built during the Prohibition era. They used it to smuggle contraband in and out of the prison back then. It's been sealed off for years." I hesitated at the top of the stairs, peering down into the blackness below. "You're sure it's still open?" "I'm sure," Red replied, his voice steady. "I've been down there. It connects to the old drainage system. Once we get through, it'll take us outside the walls." Outside the walls? That was the goal, wasn't it? But something gnawed at me, a feeling that this wasn't just about escaping anymore. There was something else, something Red wasn't telling me. But I didn't have time to question it now. The guards would be closing in soon, and the fires above were growing stronger. We had to move. Red started down the stairs without waiting for me, his flashlight bobbing in the darkness like a beacon. I followed close behind, my footsteps echoing off the cold stone walls. The stairwell was narrow, the ceiling low, and the air felt heavier the further down we went. It was like descending into the belly of the beast, one final test before freedom. At the bottom, the stairwell opened up into a small chamber lined with pipes and rusted machinery, relics of a time long past. The walls were damp with condensation, and the floor was slick with grime. In the corner, a narrow passageway led deeper into the underground system, the darkness swallowing it whole. "This way," Red said, his voice barely audible over the sound of dripping water. We moved quickly, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the wet stone beneath us. The passageway twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the bowels of the prison. At times, the ceiling was so low we had to duck to avoid hitting our heads. The walls were lined with old pipes, some of them leaking, others covered in layers of rust. The further we went, the more claustrophobic it became. The air was thick with moisture, and the sound of dripping water echoed all around us. It was hard to tell how far we had gone or how much further we had to go. All I knew was that Red seemed sure of the way, and I had no choice but to trust him. After what felt like an eternity, the passageway opened up into a larger chamber, its walls lined with thick, rusted pipes. In the center of the room was an old metal hatch, partially buried beneath layers of dirt and grime. "There it is," Red said, shining his light on the hatch. "That's our way out." I moved closer, crouching down beside the hatch. It was covered in rust, the metal warped from years of neglect. I could see the faint outline of the drainage system Red had mentioned, a network of pipes and tunnels that connected to the river outside the prison walls. "We'll have to pry it open," Red said, pulling a crowbar from his jacket. I nodded, grabbing the other end of the crowbar, as we wedged it beneath the edge of the hatch. With a grunt, we pushed down, the rusted metal groaning in protest. For a moment, it seemed like it wouldn't budge, but then, with a sharp crack, the hatch gave way, revealing a narrow tunnel leading down into darkness. Red wiped the sweat from his brow, breathing hard. "This is it, Finch. Once we go through, there's no turning back." I stared down into the tunnel, my heart racing. The cold air rising up from below felt like a final warning, a reminder that we were crossing into the unknown. But what choice did we have? Coldwater was burning above us, Norton was hunting us down, and there was no way out except forward. I looked at Red, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the flashlight. For a moment I saw something in his eyes, something I hadn't seen before. It wasn't fear, exactly, but something close to it. A kind of resolve, tempered by the weight of everything he had endured in this hellhole. This was his moment. The moment he had been working toward all these years. "Let's go," I said, my voice steady. Red nodded and climbed down into the tunnel first, disappearing into the darkness. I followed close behind, the walls of the tunnel closing in around me as we descended into the depths of the earth. The sound of the riot above faded into the distance, replaced by the steady drip of water and the creaking of old pipes. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading us deeper underground. The air was damp and stale, and the walls were slick with moisture. At times, the tunnel was so narrow that we had to crawl on our hands and knees, the darkness pressing in from all sides. But Red kept moving, his flashlight cutting through the blackness like a lifeline. And I followed, because there was no turning back now. We were almost free. Almost. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, a dark, winding snake beneath the prison that felt like it could swallow us whole. With every step, the walls pulsed with moisture, reminding me of the world above, the chaos, the smoke, the fires raging in the heart of Coldwater. I could hear faint echoes of the riot above us, muffled shouts and the distant crack of gunfire, but it felt like a world away. Here, in this subterranean labyrinth, it was just us and the darkness. Red led the way, his flashlight beam flickering as we crawled deeper into the tunnel. My heart raced with a mix of fear and adrenaline, the thrill of the unknown propelling me forward. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted, that somewhere up there, Norton and his guards were searching for us, determined to snuff out our last chance at freedom. "Do you think they'll find us?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as I followed closely behind Red. "What if we're trapped down here?" Red paused for a moment, glancing back at me with a level stare. "We're not trapped unless we let ourselves be," he replied, his voice calm and reassuring. "Keep moving. The only way out is forward." I nodded, swallowing my fears and pushing ahead. The tunnel narrowed again, forcing us to crawl on our hands and knees, scraping against the damp walls as we went. Time lost all meaning down here. It felt like we had been in this tunnel for hours, every second stretching into eternity. At last, we emerged into another chamber, a larger, slightly better lit space illuminated by the faint glow of a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The chamber was lined with old machinery, rusted and forgotten, remnants of a time when this place had served a different purpose. Pipes snaked across the walls, and in the corner stood a large, old metal door, half covered in dirt and cobwebs. "Is that it?" I breathed, my heart racing as I looked at the door. It was heavy and imposing, a final barrier between us and the world outside. Red stepped forward, shining the flashlight on the door. "This leads to the drainage system," he said, running a hand over the metal surface. "If it's still operational, it'll take us out to the river." I felt a rush of hope. "Then let's get this open," I said, eager to finally escape the confines of this prison. Together, we pushed against the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was rusted shut, the hinges frozen in place from years of neglect. I could feel my frustration building, the heat of the riot above mingling with the dampness of the tunnel, but Red remained calm. "Let's find something to pry it open," he said, scanning the room for tools. He moved to a stack of old crates in the corner, rummaging through them until he pulled out a crowbar, its metal surface caked with rust. "Perfect," I said, taking it from him. "Let's do this." With Red guiding me, we wedged the crowbar into the crack between the door and the frame, applying all our strength. It creaked ominously, but slowly, inch by inch, it began to give way. Just as I felt the hope bubbling up inside me, the door suddenly swung open with a loud crash, revealing a dark tunnel beyond. We exchanged a glance, adrenaline surging between us. "We're almost there," Red said, his eyes alight with determination. As we stepped through the doorway, the air felt different, fresher, cooler, laced with the scent of damp earth and flowing water. The tunnel ahead curved downward, and the sound of rushing water grew louder as we moved further in. "Can you hear that?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's the river." Red nodded, urgency in his movements. "We need to keep going. We'll follow the water until we reach the surface." The passageway sloped down, slick with mud, and I stumbled as we hurried forward. I could feel my heart racing, the anticipation coursing through me. The thought of being free, of leaving Coldwater behind, made every scrape against the stone walls worth it. But the sense of urgency only deepened as the sounds of chaos from above intensified. The shouts grew louder, closer. I could almost imagine the guards frantically searching for us, their footsteps echoing through the halls of the prison as they pieced together our escape. "Keep moving," Red urged, glancing back at me with a fierce determination. "We can't let them catch us now." We pressed on, the water's roar growing louder as we reached a junction in the tunnel. The path split into two, one leading to the left and the other to the right. I hesitated, scanning both options as the sound of rushing water echoed in my ears. Which way? I asked, breathless. Right, Red said without missing a beat. The drainage system opens up down that way. Follow the sound of the water. I nodded, and we veered right, adrenaline coursing through our veins as we sprinted down the tunnel. The walls closed in around us, the shadows dancing as our flashlights flickered, but the sound of the river grew louder with each step, filling me with hope. As we rounded a bend, the tunnel opened up into a larger chamber, the sound of rushing water echoing all around us. I could see the river now, its dark waters flowing swiftly beneath a series of metal grates. But just as we reached the edge, a loud crash echoed from the tunnel behind us. Red froze, his expression shifting from determination to alarm. We need to hide. Now! We ducked behind a nearby pile of debris just as the sound of footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate. I held my breath, peering around the edge of the crates to see who was coming. A group of guards emerged from the tunnel, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Search every inch of this place, one of the guards shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. They can't have gotten far. We'll find them. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, fear mixing with adrenaline as they moved closer. My eyes darted around the chamber, searching for any means of escape. The grates above the river seemed sturdy, but I wondered if they could be pried open. They're coming this way, I whispered to Red, my voice trembling. What do we do? Red scanned the area, his mind racing. We can't stay here. We need to make a move. The guards were getting closer, their voices sharp with authority. Check the grates. They might have gone for the river. Just then, a beam of light swept over our hiding spot, and I froze, heart racing as the guard's flashlight illuminated the debris we were crouching behind. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't look closely enough to spot us. Over there! One of the guards shouted, pointing towards a dark corner of the chamber. Go! Go! Red urged, and without thinking, I darted toward the river, crouching low to avoid the beam of light. We reached the grates just as the guards began to fan out, closing in on our location. We have to get out now! I yelled, desperation clawing at my throat. Red nodded, grabbing the crowbar and jamming it between the grates, trying to pry them open. The metal creaked, straining under the pressure. I glanced back, and the guards were getting closer, their flashlights moving erratically through the darkness. Come on! I urged, panic rising in my chest. Faster! With one final effort, Red yanked on the crowbar, and the grates finally gave way, crashing to the ground with a loud clang that echoed through the chamber. We didn't hesitate. We scrambled through the opening just as the guards shouted behind us. The cold water rushed up to meet us as we plunged into the river, its current strong and unyielding. The shock of the icy water took my breath away, but there was no time to think. We kicked our legs and swam for the shore, propelling ourselves against the current with everything we had. I could hear the guards shouting above us, their voices muffled by the roar of the water. The fear of being caught surged within me, pushing me forward as I fought against the icy grip of the river. Red was beside me, his strokes powerful as he led the way toward the distant shore. Finally, we reached the bank, gasping for air as we scrambled onto the muddy ground. We collapsed, panting heavily, our hearts racing as we listened for any sign of pursuit. Did they see us? I asked, scanning the area for any signs of the guards. Red shook his head, a glimmer of relief crossing his face. I don't think so. We need to move quickly. They'll be searching the river. We pushed ourselves up, adrenaline still coursing through our veins as we moved away from the water's edge. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the landscape. I could see the dense trees lining the riverbank, their shadows stretching long and dark. Which way now? I asked, my voice hoarse from the cold water. Into the woods, Red replied, gesturing toward the trees. We'll stay low and keep moving until we're far enough away. As we plunged into the underbrush, I felt a sense of exhilaration wash over me. We were finally free, out of cold water, out of that hellish prison. But even as I ran, even as the cool night air filled my lungs, the weight of what we'd done hung heavy over us. Freedom wasn't just a matter of leaving the walls of Coldwater behind. It was surviving the world beyond, one that might be just as unforgiving. The forest closed in around us, dense and alive with sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Each noise was a reminder that out here, we were no longer prisoners, but fugitives. As we pushed through the underbrush, the adrenaline from our escape slowly ebbed, replaced by exhaustion and the cold reality of our situation. "Do you think they'll follow us this far?" I asked, my breath visible in the chill night air. Red glanced at me, his face etched with determination. "They'll try. But they're not going to search forever. We've got a head start, and if we stay smart, we can keep it." We kept moving deeper into the woods, our pace slowing as the adrenaline wore off and fatigue set in. Every step felt like a battle against the weight of the past few hours, running, hiding, swimming through the freezing river. My muscles ached, and the cold night air bit at my skin, but the thought of stopping never crossed my mind. We couldn't afford to. After what felt like hours of walking, Red motioned for us to stop. "We'll rest here for a while," he said, his voice low as he scanned the area. "We need to stay sharp, but we also need our strength." We found a small clearing, shielded by thick trees. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and though it wasn't much, it was the closest thing to comfort we'd had in days. I sank down onto the ground, grateful for the moment of reprieve. Red sat beside me, his eyes scanning the darkness. "You did good back there," he said quietly. "Not everyone could have made it through that." I looked at him, surprised by the compliment. "I just kept thinking about freedom," I admitted. "About what it would mean to finally be out of that place." Red nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's what keeps us going, isn't it? The idea of something better. Even if we're not sure what that looks like anymore." I didn't know how to respond to that. Freedom was all I had thought about for so long, but now that we were out, the reality of it was overwhelming. What did freedom even mean for us, after all we'd been through? Could we really just disappear, start over somewhere new? As we sat in the stillness of the night, the weight of everything we had left behind pressed down on me. Coldwater, Norton, the life we'd known inside those walls. It was all still out there, chasing us in one way or another. "What now?" I asked, breaking the silence. "What do we do next?" Red leaned back against a tree, his eyes focused on the stars above. "We keep moving," he said simply. "We get as far away from Coldwater as we can. There's a town a few miles from here, small, off the radar. We can lay low for a bit, figure out our next move." I nodded, though the uncertainty gnawed at me. There was no going back, no safety net. Everything from here on out was uncharted territory. But even with the fear and uncertainty, there was something else, a spark of hope. We had made it this far. We had survived Coldwater, outwitted Norton, escaped the guards. There was a part of me that believed we could keep going, that we could really be free. We sat in silence for a while longer, resting but always listening, always alert. I could hear the faint rustling of the trees, the distant calls of animals in the night. For the first time in what felt like forever, the sounds were peaceful, a reminder that there was a world beyond the walls of the prison, a world we were finally a part of again. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, Red stood, his face set with determination. "Time to go," he said, his voice steady. "We've got a long way ahead of us." I pushed myself to my feet, my body protesting every movement, but I didn't care. We were still alive. We were still moving forward. And that, I realized, was all that mattered. We disappeared into the forest, leaving behind the life we had known for so long. Coldwater was behind us, but I knew the real fight was just beginning. The next few days passed in a blur of movement and survival. We traveled by night, sticking to back roads and forest trails, avoiding any place where we might be recognized. Red's plan was simple: head south, cross into the next state, and find a place to blend in. Somewhere small and quiet, where two ex-convicts could disappear without a trace. But the farther we got from Coldwater, the more I realized how difficult that would be. The world outside wasn't the same as the one we had left behind. The scars of our time in prison ran deep, and every interaction felt like a test. Could people see what we had been through? Did they know just by looking at us? We stayed in cheap motels when we could afford it, using cash that Red had hidden away before the escape. When money ran low, we slept in the woods or in abandoned buildings, always on edge, always ready to run. One night, as we huddled around a small fire in the woods, I asked Red something that had been gnawing at me for days. "Do you ever think about what we left behind? The others?" Red didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I think about them every day," he said quietly. "But they made their choice, just like we made ours. Not everyone can leave. Some don't even want to." I thought about the men we had known in Coldwater, the ones who had spent decades inside those walls. Men like Brooks, who couldn't survive on the outside. Would they even recognize us now? Or had we become something different, something unrecognizable? "We did what we had to do," Red said, his voice firm. "But we can't carry the weight of the past with us. If we want to survive out here, we have to keep looking forward." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I completely agreed. The past had a way of clinging to you, no matter how fast you ran. But Red was right about one thing: we had to survive. There was no going back. We made it to a small town near the state line, a quiet place nestled in the mountains. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, but strangers could pass through without too much suspicion. We rented a room in a rundown boarding house on the edge of town, paying cash and keeping to ourselves. For the first time in weeks, we allowed ourselves to breathe, to believe that maybe, just maybe, we had outrun the past. But I knew better than to let my guard down. We had escaped Coldwater, but the ghosts of that place still haunted us. Norton's reach was long, and I had no doubt he would be looking for us, eager to exact his revenge. And then there was the matter of the money. Red had been careful, but the paper trail wasn't completely erased. If anyone connected the dots, they would come looking for us. The thought of being dragged back to that hellish prison kept me awake at night, the fear gnawing at me like a constant itch. Still, we had made it this far. We had survived. And for the first time in years, there was a sliver of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, we could make a life for ourselves out here. But deep down, I knew the fight wasn't over. We had escaped Coldwater, but freedom was still a long way off. And the past had a way of catching up with you when you least expected it. The town we'd landed in was a far cry from the chaos and violence of Coldwater. There was something almost picturesque about it. The main street was lined with small shops, an old diner, a hardware store, and a bar where locals gathered. A river wound through the valley just a few miles outside the town, offering a place to hide or run if things went south. We kept a low profile, of course. That was the deal. We weren't here to be noticed. Red had always been good at blending in, and I followed his lead. He taught me how to walk like you belong, how to nod at someone without really inviting conversation. In a place like this, too many questions could ruin everything. But no matter how much distance we put between ourselves and Coldwater, the tension never left. It lived in the air around us, an invisible force that wrapped tighter around my chest every time I looked over my shoulder. I knew Red felt it too, though he didn't say it out loud. His eyes were always scanning, his movements deliberate, cautious. That was how we stayed alive, by staying sharp. Red had managed to get us some work at a nearby scrapyard. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep food on the table and give us a reason to be in town without raising suspicion. The owner, Frank, was an old guy who didn't ask too many questions, which made him perfect for our situation. "You boys just keep your heads down and work hard," Frank said one afternoon, handing me a cold beer after a long shift. "Don't need to know where you came from. Just need to know you can work." That was fine by us. We weren't looking for a friend. Just a way to keep surviving. The days turned into weeks, and for a while, it almost felt like we had a chance. Like we'd found a pocket of normalcy in this quiet, forgotten town. Red and I would wake up early, work the scrapyard, and spend our evenings back at the boarding house. Every once in a while, we'd hit the bar and drink in silence, listening to the idle chatter of locals who had no idea what we'd been through. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was temporary. That somehow, The life we'd built was fragile, like a house of cards that could collapse at any moment. And that collapse came sooner than I expected. It started with the arrival of two men in town, suits too sharp for a place like this. They parked their black sedan near the diner and started asking questions. At first, they posed as insurance adjusters, something about a recent fire outside town, but Red and I had seen enough men like them to know what they really were. "They're looking for someone," Red said one evening after spotting them through the window of the bar. His voice was low, calm, but I could see the tension in his eyes. "It's only a matter of time before they find out it's us." I felt the old panic rising in my chest, but Red placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "We've prepared for this," he said. "We don't panic. We think." He was right. We couldn't just bolt. That would make us look guilty. And where would we go anyway? We'd run this far, and now there were eyes on us. The question was, how had they found us? Was it Norton's men? Or was this something else, someone putting pieces together from the trail we'd left behind? We didn't have long to find out. That night, after the town had gone to sleep, we packed our few belongings into 2 small duffel bags, preparing for the worst. Red had a plan. He always did. The river. If things went south, we could use it to disappear, float downstream, and slip out of town without a trace. But as we sat in the cramped room at the boarding house, waiting for dawn, I couldn't help but wonder if this was it. If, after all the running, we'd finally hit the wall we couldn't escape. Around midnight, there was a knock at the door. My heart stopped. Red and I exchanged a look, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind. He motioned for me to stay still, his hand moving slowly toward the small revolver we'd kept hidden under the mattress. I hadn't heard him mention the gun in weeks, but now, with that knock, its presence felt like a lifeline. The knock came again, this time more urgent. Red moved toward the door, gun tucked behind his back. He glanced through the peephole, then exhaled. "It's Frank," he whispered. I stood up, confused, and watched as Red opened the door a crack. "Frank, what the hell are you doing here?" Red asked, his voice low and tight. Frank stepped inside, closing the door behind him quickly. "They've been asking about you too," he said in a hurried whisper. "Those men, they came by the scrapyard today. Said they were with the feds, looking for a couple of guys who escaped from a prison up north." I felt the blood drain from my face. We had been careful. So careful. "They know it's you," Frank continued, his eyes darting between us. "I didn't say anything, but I don't know how long I can keep them off your backs. They're checking everywhere, asking around." Red stayed calm, but I could see the storm brewing beneath his surface. "How much time do we have?" Frank shrugged helplessly. "Maybe a day, maybe less. They're staying in town tonight. I thought I'd give you a heads up before it's too late." Red nodded, his mind already calculating our next steps. "You did good, Frank. We owe you." Frank looked like he wanted to say something else, maybe offer a way out, but he knew as well as we did that there was no easy solution to this. He turned and left as quickly as he came, leaving us alone with the crushing reality of our situation. "They know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's over, isn't it?" Red shook his head. "Not yet," he said firmly. "But it will be if we don't move fast." And just like that, we were in motion again. We grabbed the duffel bags, packed with whatever essentials we had left, and slipped out of the boarding house under cover of night. Our hearts pounded in unison, the adrenaline surging as we made our way toward the river. The plan was simple: get to the river, disappear, and let the current carry us far away from this town and the men hunting us. But nothing about our lives had ever been simple. The walk to the river was tense, every rustle of leaves and snap of a branch sending my nerves into overdrive. We stuck to the shadows, avoiding the main streets and keeping close to the tree line. The river wasn't far, maybe a mile or 2, but every step felt like 1,000. As we neared the water, I glanced over at Red. His face was set in stone, focused, but there was a weariness there I hadn't seen before. The weight of all we'd been through was starting to show. When we reached the riverbank, I felt a brief surge of relief. The water glistened under the moonlight, its current slow but steady. This was it, our way out. But just as we were about to step into the water, a figure emerged from the trees. "Stop right there!" a voice called out, cold and sharp. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The figure stepped forward, and I saw the glint of a badge pinned to his chest. One of the men from town. One of the men hunting us. And behind him, 2 more figures emerged from the shadows, guns drawn and ready. This was it. The moment we'd been running from all along. But Red didn't panic. He raised his hands slowly, turning to face the men, his expression unreadable. I did the same, every fiber of my being screaming for a way out. But there was none. "Looks like we found you," the lead agent said, stepping closer. "End of the line, gentlemen." For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't know what would happen next. The tension was electric, crackling in the air between us and the men closing in. My heart raced, pounding so hard it felt like my ribs would crack. Red stood next to me, his arms still raised, but his eyes were like ice, calculating, watching for any opening, any mistake from the agents that could give us a chance. The agent in the lead, the one who had spoken, took another step toward us. His hand rested on the butt of his gun, but he hadn't drawn it. His eyes flicked between Red and me, sizing us up. He was confident, too confident, and I could feel Red pick up on it. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the agent said, his voice steady, but I caught the faintest hint of strain behind it. "You're both coming with us, alive or dead. Let's not make it the latter." The words echoed in my head, but all I could focus on was the sound of the river rushing behind us, a silent promise of escape. But how? There were 3 of them, armed, and they had us dead to rights. Red was still motionless, though I saw his eyes dart toward the water for the briefest second. I knew what he was thinking. I'd been with him long enough to know that he wasn't the type to just give up, to let the world box him in. There was always a way, even when the odds seemed impossible. I clenched my fists at my sides, trying to think, trying to see any way out of this that didn't end in bloodshed. But the longer we stood there, the more certain I became that we were out of time. One wrong move, and we'd be dead before we hit the ground. "You think you can run?" the agent asked, reading the tension in our bodies, the silent exchange between Red and me. "Don't be stupid. We've got backup in town. There's no way out of this." He took another step forward, and that was when Red acted. Without warning, Red lunged toward the man, his movements quick, precise, and brutal. In one fluid motion, he brought his elbow up and slammed it into the agent's throat, cutting off his air in a gurgling gasp. The man's gun clattered to the ground as he stumbled back, clutching his throat, his face twisted in pain and shock. It happened so fast, the other 2 agents barely had time to react. "Run!" Red shouted, his voice snapping me out of the paralysis that had gripped me. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted toward the river, my feet pounding against the wet earth as I heard the agents shout in confusion. Gunfire erupted behind me, the sharp crack of bullets cutting through the night air. I didn't look back. Red was right behind me, and we ran toward the only escape we had left. The river. We hit the water hard, the icy current immediately pulling at us, trying to drag us under. The cold shocked my system, but I fought to stay afloat, my arms thrashing as I tried to get my bearings. The gunshots had stopped, but I knew they weren't far behind. The river wasn't deep, but it was fast. It carried us downstream, away from the shore, away from the men hunting us. The water was like a battering ram, pulling me under, slamming me into rocks hidden just beneath the surface. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. "Keep moving!" Red shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the river. I could see him struggling too, but his eyes were still sharp, still focused. He knew this was our only shot, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. The current dragged us downriver for what felt like miles, though in reality, it was probably only a few hundred yards. My muscles burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I kept swimming, kept letting the water carry me as far away from the agents as possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the river began to slow, and I spotted a low bank on the other side. Red was already moving toward it, and I followed, my body screaming in protest with every stroke. We crawled onto the muddy bank, gasping for breath, our clothes soaked and heavy. The world spun around me, and for a moment, all I could do was lie there, trying to regain control of my breathing. Red was already on his feet, his eyes scanning the trees around us. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice ragged but steady. "They'll figure out where we went. We need to keep moving." I pushed myself to my feet, every muscle in my body aching. "Where?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I even had the strength to keep running. Red pointed to the thick forest that stretched out beyond the riverbank. "We disappear. We head into the woods and lose them. By the time they catch up, we'll be long gone." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only one we had. I nodded, swallowing the fear and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm me. "Let's go." We moved into the trees, the thick underbrush slowing us down, but offering us cover. The farther we went, the more the world around us seemed to close in, the towering trees blocking out the moonlight and plunging us into near total darkness. But we didn't stop. We couldn't. Every step forward was a step away from the life we'd left behind, from the men who wanted us dead. We pushed on for hours, our bodies moving on pure adrenaline, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death. The forest was dense, the terrain unforgiving, but Red led the way, his instincts guiding us deeper into the wilderness. There was no path, no clear direction, just survival. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I stumbled, my legs giving out beneath me. Red grabbed my arm, pulling me back to my feet. "Don't stop now," he said, his voice firm but kind. "We're almost there." "Where?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. The fear that had fueled me was burning out, leaving only fatigue in its place. "Anywhere but here," Red said, and that was enough. We moved again, though my steps were slower, heavier. The night stretched on, endless and unforgiving, but still we pushed forward. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees that Red finally stopped. We'd reached a clearing, a small, open space surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp, the morning chill biting at my skin, but the sight of it felt like a victory. Red turned to me, his eyes tired but alive with determination. "We rest here," he said. "Just for a bit. They won't catch us now. Not here." I nodded, too exhausted to argue, and collapsed onto the damp earth. My body ached, my mind spun, but for the first time in what felt like days, I allowed myself to breathe. Red sat down beside me, his eyes scanning the horizon, always alert, always watching. But in that moment, with the dawn breaking over the forest and the river far behind us, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't over. Not yet. But the end was closer than it had ever been. We rested for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. The cool earth beneath me felt like a welcome relief after everything we'd just gone through. My body, aching and bruised, had almost given out entirely. Red sat beside me, his breathing slow and measured, but I could see in his eyes that he was still planning. Still calculating. The forest around us was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. We were deep in the wilderness now, far from the agents, the city, and everything we'd left behind. But as peaceful as it seemed, there was no denying the reality of our situation. We were fugitives, and the longer we stayed in one place, the closer they'd get. Red finally broke the silence. "We need to make a decision," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We can't keep running forever." I knew he was right, but the thought of giving up, of surrendering after coming this far, felt impossible. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Red looked out at the horizon, the faint light of dawn filtering through the trees. "I'm saying we disappear for good. We find a place where no one can find us, live out the rest of our days in peace. But to do that, we have to vanish completely." The weight of his words hit me like a stone. "How?" He stood up, pacing in the small clearing, his mind clearly racing. There's a town, about 20 miles from here. Not big, but enough to get us what we need. We can head there, get supplies, and then we go off the grid. For real this time. I nodded, trying to wrap my head around the plan. It made sense. Red had always been resourceful, always 2 steps ahead of everyone else. If anyone could pull this off, it was him. We stood, our bodies still sore and heavy with exhaustion, and made our way through the forest, keeping low and moving cautiously. Every rustle in the leaves, every distant crack of a branch, sent a wave of adrenaline through me. But as the sun rose higher in the sky, the fear that had gripped me so tightly began to loosen. For the first time in a long while, I began to feel like maybe, just maybe, we could make it. Hours passed as we navigated the thick woods, moving farther and farther away from the river, from the danger. By the time we emerged from the forest, we found ourselves on the outskirts of a small, sleepy town. It wasn't much, just a few buildings, a general store, a gas station. But to us, it was salvation. We split up, Red said, eyeing the town carefully. I'll go get the supplies. You find us some clothes, something to blend in. I nodded, understanding the need for caution. We couldn't afford to be recognized, not now. Not when we were so close to freedom. I made my way to a small thrift shop on the edge of town, slipping inside quietly. The store was empty, save for an old woman behind the counter, her eyes barely registering me as I rifled through the racks of clothes. I grabbed a couple of worn jackets, some jeans, and a few hats to cover our faces. It wasn't much, but it would do. When I met back up with Red outside of town, he had a small bag slung over his shoulder, filled with supplies, food, water, and a map. He grinned at me, his face alive with that spark of determination that had kept us going all these years. We're almost there, he said, and for the first time in days, I believed him. We made our way deeper into the wilderness, heading farther away from any trace of civilization. The land stretched out before us, vast and untouched, a place where no one would think to look for 2 escaped convicts. The air was crisp, the trees tall and ancient, and for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. As we walked, Red started talking, more to himself than to me. He spoke about everything we'd been through, the years of confinement, the endless days in that concrete tomb. And yet, through it all, he never lost that glimmer of hope. You know, he said, his voice thoughtful. When I first got locked up, I didn't think I'd ever see the outside world again. I didn't think I'd survive, honestly. I glanced at him, seeing the weight of all those years in his eyes. But you did. He nodded. Yeah, I did. And now, here we are. We didn't talk much after that. There wasn't much left to say. We both knew what we were leaving behind, and we both understood what we were walking toward. A new life, one free of bars, guards, and cold, gray walls. It was a life we had earned, through blood and sweat and the sheer will to survive. By the time the sun began to set again, we found ourselves at the edge of a small lake, its waters calm and still, reflecting the vibrant colors of the sky. Red sat down on the shore, his eyes scanning the horizon. I joined him, the cool breeze brushing against my face as we sat in silence, watching the world settle into twilight. This is it, Red said quietly. This is where we start over. I didn't say anything, but I didn't need to. We both knew what this moment meant. After all the pain, the suffering, the heartache, we had finally found our peace. Over the next few weeks, we built ourselves a small cabin by the lake. It wasn't much, just enough to keep us warm and dry, but it was ours. We fished in the mornings, spent our days fixing up the place, and in the evenings, we sat by the fire, talking about the future. A future that was finally ours to shape. As the years passed, the world moved on without us. We heard rumors, stories of how the authorities eventually gave up the search, how our names faded from the headlines. In the end, we had become ghosts, living quietly in the shadow of the past. And yet, despite everything we had been through, I never felt more alive. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I was free. Truly free. Red and I grew old by that lake, watching the seasons change, the trees grow taller, the stars shimmer in the night sky. It was a simple life, but it was one built on hope, resilience, and a friendship forged in the darkest of places. In the end, we found our redemption, not in the walls of Shawshank, but in the quiet peace of the wilderness, far from the world that had once tried to break us. And as the sun set on our final days, I knew that we had won. Not because we had escaped, but because we had survived. Thank you for listening.